So we are developing a Christological approach to everything. And what we're trying to do is rethink through all these disciplines. It's as though we've discovered a new continent and we're mapping it out, or it's been mapped out for us, and we're just going in and finding the best routes possible for things, to ask the best questions, to allow ourselves to be informed by the biblical and theological sciences, but not determined by them. Okay, and this is very important. It's important to be informed because the fact is, there is a debate on just about anything and everything you can imagine out there in biblical studies and in theology. I mean, it's astounding. I can almost recommend a PhD dissertation on any small section of the New Testament. There's been somebody that's written 400 pages on a verse. I mean, it's amazing how much is out there. And then to recognize that the so-called assured results of New Testament studies are anything but assured. We can have good conviction about things, but there's nothing to be certain about in biblical studies. So there's a distinction to be drawn between having good conviction, where you can lay out the evidence for your position, but also recognize that there are gaps in that. So one of the things that I want to do tonight is to talk about clarifying Jesus, because I stated in a previous lecture that Jesus cannot be directly known. And now you'll remember that lecture because I talked about the resurrection narratives and how in each instance in the resurrection narratives, Jesus was not seen as Jesus. He was seen by Mary Magdalene as the gardener. The guys on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize him. The disciples in the upper room thought they were seeing the ghost. That is, when Jesus comes post-resurrection to anyone, the question is always that of Saul. Who are you, Lord? There is no direct relationship any of us have with Jesus, just as we don't have a direct relationship with the Father unless it's mediated by Jesus. So we have no direct relationship to Jesus unless it is mediated to us by the Holy Spirit. But we don't have direct access in this sense to any part or person within the Trinity. We just don't. Our world, that is the way this is constructed for us, begins with trust. There is a message here. It is a good message. It's a redefinition of the category of God entirely, and we learn to trust that and live into this life that we recognize as Jesus of Nazareth, and by that same trust, allow him to live his life in us. And we do that by following this pattern of discipleship. And so we've talked about this over and over and over, and I hope you're beginning to see how this all works together. Now, I know that most of you have regular lives and can't spend your day reading. So what I did was I said to myself, if I could recommend a selection of books that you might want to take your time with over the next 1 to 10 years, in order to gain enough solid knowledge of Second Temple Judaism, which books would those be? And I want to begin, first of all, by reading a paragraph that comes out of a book I wrote. Okay. And this is what it says. This is 2010 when I wrote this. This brings me directly to a core conviction, namely that Scripture does not make sense until we see Jesus in the context of his culture. There is a superficial approach to biblical culture in the Christian church. Old reference works are the norm. You go to any church library, I'm leaving the text, obviously, but you go look at any church library, and it's all basically garbage if it has anything at all in there on Second Temple Judaism. It's all stuff from the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's not reflective at all of the incredible gains that have been made in the last 70 years. I'll continue. Those who use these old reference works are completely unaware of the reassessment both ancient Judaism and Christianity have undergone and continue to undergo since the 1950s. That is, as more and more pieces are being put together, viewpoints on older, on topics that had long established viewpoints are being challenged, and in some cases, replacing older viewpoints. And this is very important. The most important element in bringing about this approach was the Shoah, the genocide of the Jews under Nazi rule, and then the growing and profitable Jewish-Christian dialogues, particularly amongst biblical scholars. A key consequence of this new interpretation was that as we understood the groups in Jesus' culture differently, we also understood Jesus differently. He became clearer as they became clearer. It is no longer Jesus and Christians versus Judaism. We have learned to know Jesus the Jew, and Jesus is not the first Christian. He's a Jew. Paul did not convert from Judaism to Christianity. Paul never underwent a religious conversion away from Judaism. He was always a Jew, a lifelong Jew. And the same with the apostles, the Galilean 12. The church, back to the book, has a tendency to de-Judaize Jesus. When this happens, Jesus is understood as the perfect sacrifice sent from God to redeem us from our sin. His life doesn't count, except as a preparation for sacrifice. The emphasis shifts from how Jesus lived as a model for our discipleship to how Jesus kept God's law perfectly so he could be a perfect sinless sacrifice. De-Judaizing Jesus removes a key lens when interpreting Jesus' relationship to the people of his time. Paul gives us a clue that this is very important in Galatians 4:4 when he says that Jesus was born at the right time, born of a woman, born under Torah. The interpretive background of Jesus is the many different strategies of Torah and how they played out amongst the people. How did others interpret Torah? And what did Jesus bring to the table when he interpreted Torah? That to me is the heart of the matter. I've been wrestling with over 30 years, and now I can say 11 years later, over 40 years. So this is something that for a layperson, it's intimidating, because the sheer amount of literature that is being produced by the month right now is absolutely astonishing and remarkable. Tonight, I'm going to work through a brief bibliography with you and then talk about some of the consequences of learning these various parts and pieces in and around what we're calling Second Temple Judaism. And again, you can find most of these books on Amazon. I also, in the group today, I put one of the books I'm recommending tonight plus two others. So you have a little something to start with if you want there. It's in the group already. You can go just download those PDF files and start reading. A word about reading anything that's new. First of all, when authors write books, they're writing within a stream of interpretation and conflict. No book is written because it was given by divine inspiration and has no connection to anything else. Every book that's written has a direct connection to a historical context, and that includes every single one of my books. Okay. And when you put pen to paper, or you become a keyboard warrior and you're writing books. The fact is, you change your mind. And so those that are clever will be able to go back to my earliest work and see where I've changed my mind about certain topics over the years. And so when you're reading a book, so for example, the first book we're going to talk about is Bridge Between the Testaments. And by the way, the bibliography is in the group. So you don't have to be writing fast and furious here as I hold the books up and down. But this book was written in the 1970s and reissued in the 1980s. There have been a lot of books written on this topic since then, but this is a readable book, okay? It's an eminently readable book on the period of time from the exile till Jesus. Why do you need to know this? If you landed in America today from another planet and you only knew the last 50 years of its history, would you be able to explain America today or anybody living in America today? Wouldn't you have to know something about the world wars or industrial and technological changes in the 20th century, in the 19th century? Wouldn't you need to know about the Civil War? Wouldn't you need to know about the Revolutionary War in order to understand America? Yes, you would. In the same way, there's a lot that's happening in the 300 or so years before Jesus. That is, when Alexander the Great comes along and begins the Hellenization of the area he controlled around the Mediterranean. From that point on, Judaism is going to begin to have a series of specific reactions, some more positive, some less positive, some very positive, and some very negative. And as these various viewpoints are expressed, different groups are formed. And then those groups vie for power. And if you aren't aware of this, then you're going to assume that the Pharisees always existed or the Sadducees always existed. You might not even know who they are or what they're about. You know, all you're taught in church is that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection and the Pharisees were legalists. That's all they teach you in church. And that's true, the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, but there's far more to a Sadducee than that. And the Pharisees may have at times been very nitpicky, but they weren't that way in order to somehow find themselves favor with God. There was an entirely different project that's going on. And we're going to talk about some of that tonight. So in order to have a general framework, where I'm going to begin is with the larger perspective. So we've talked about the importance of intertestamental history, the stuff that's going on, the 300 years before Jesus. You know, how important is it to understand the Maccabean Revolution? It's fundamental. If you don't understand the Maccabean Revolution, how can you understand the rise of the Pharisees or the Sadducees? Or the community around the teacher of righteousness in Qumran? Or the scribal tradition, what's its relation to this revolution? How can you begin to understand anything related to the kingship and the high priesthood until you realize that the Maccabees combined those two into one office for a time? So it wasn't a Levitical high priesthood. And that was just irksome to certain groups. You know, and then there's all the conflicts that go on between the Pharisees and Sadducees. You can read about all of this in Josephus, of course. And most of a good deal, I should say, of what we know about this period comes from the Apocrypha, like First Maccabees and Second Maccabees and Josephus. So it's important to have a feel for the history, for the framework. And when you're reading these books, don't worry about memorizing names and all that kind of thing, because I guarantee you, it took me 20 years to finally have enough in my head that I could put names and dates together. It's just, there's so much that's going on you can't remember it all, but you can remember the important things. And that's what's really key here as you're going through history, the historical process. The next book is by Casey Hansen and Doug Oakman. It's called Palestine in the Time of Jesus, Social Structures and Social Conflicts. This is an important book. It's, as I recall, it's a collection of no, it's a co-written book. Okay. Yes. And so they're going to talk about everything from family relationships to pyramids of power, the economy, the Jerusalem temple, and this kind of thing. Big picture, Palestine in the time of Jesus. Now, in the classroom, I downloaded for you an absolute treasure, Jerusalem in the Time of Jesus by Joachim Jeremias. This book has been for me an absolute godsend. I mean, it's first of all, it's physically small, so I can take it anywhere and I can open it anywhere and I can read just about anything I want to know and the sources from which they come as it relates to social class, to the economy, to sacrifice to the temple, and this, that, and the other. This is just an absolute favorite of mine. Jeremias, of course, I absolutely adore, even though I disagree with him an awful lot. In this case, this is a treasure trove. And it's, again, it's now in the classroom. It has become, in the last 20 years, essential for scholars of the Jesus tradition to understand the economy of the ancient world, and particularly the economy of Palestine and Galilee. There's a wonderful collection of essays by David Feenzy and Ralph Hawkins called The Galilean Economy in the Time of Jesus. This gives you an idea as Jesus is talking about the various types of persons and the social strata that exist within Judaism and who's being addressed with what. So you don't talk to Bill Gates the same way you talk to a bum on the street. You know what I'm saying? You're going to say different things to them if you're Jesus. To one, you're going to say, blessed are the poor. To the other, you're going to say, sell all that you have, right? So it's important to understand economics in the ancient world because in order to understand Jesus' message of debt jubilee, which is both forgiveness of sin, but it's also forgiveness of debt. Because what is sin? It's a debt that you owe to somebody because you've hurt them. So the Galilean economy in the time of Jesus. Then there is a 2-volume set just recently published by Fortress on Galilee. The first volume is Life, Culture, and Society, and the second volume is on the archaeology record from the cities, towns, and villages of Galilee. And these are indispensable. In order to understand Galilee, you want all the information you can get, and it's put together in these 2 volumes. To end this section, back at the turn of the 20th century, a German scholar by the name of Emil Schurer, S-H-U with an umlaut, R-E-R, Schurer, wrote a book, a series of books, 4 books, it's 4 volumes, The History of the Jewish People in the Age of Jesus Christ. You will see this on sale from time to time, all 4 volumes for $50. Don't buy it. Whatever you do, don't buy it. What the publishers are doing is they're trying to get rid of all the old editions that they have in their warehouse. And Christian Book Distributors is real big on this. They've been trying to sell this old edition now for 25 years. You want the revised version. Now, this is an investment. Okay, it's 4 volumes, about $50 a volume. But with these 4 volumes, you are getting as solid a background in the history, the ritual, liturgical practices, the various groups, and the last volumes are on the textual tradition, the books that are produced, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so these 4 volumes, for anybody that wants a serious library, are going to be essential, but you must get the second revised edition by Millar, Vermesh, and Black. Otherwise, you are getting old scholarship that is the kind of stuff that we're trying to avoid. When it comes to literature, now I know that most of you barely have time to read the Bible, and I get this. But some of you do have time to read the Apocrypha. You might want to read the Dead Sea Scrolls. You might want to read the Targums. You might want to read the Mishnah, or some of the Midrashim that the rabbis created in and around the stories found in the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Pseudepigraphum. You might want to read First Enoch, because First Enoch has an enormous influence, as we'll talk about in a moment, on the New Testament. Just a huge influence. In fact, the New Testament is, as I read it, is an argument against the kind of eschatology found in the Hanukkah tradition. And so you have some buying into it and others not. And so if you're going to read in this literature, you're going to at least want a guide, some help as you're reading, because while it may read in certain ways like what you'll find in Holy Scripture, in other ways, it's not going to read like the texts aren't going to read that way. So there is the collection of writings known as the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. And the Pseudepigrapha are 2 big volumes edited by James Charlesworth now. And those volumes are going to include books like First Enoch, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, the Testament of Job, apocalyptic literature, the life of Adam and Eve, all the literature that's composed, say, in the couple of 100 years before Jesus, and then the 100 years in the 1st century, that's written in the 1st century. And it's just an exhaustive, critical edition of texts, and you can dip into those. And in some cases, if you're doing research and you are in a passage in the New Testament, you're doing research, and you'll run across Paul seems to be echoing, the Testament of Benjamin here. Well, if you go look that up in the Testament of Benjamin, and you're looking up this similar kind of thinking, you're realizing Paul and the writer are in a milieu together. They're in this way of thinking. They're using similar language. Another example, Paul uses the term works of the law in Galatians. And that phrase has been understood from Augustine through Luther into today to suggest that Paul is saying that the Pharisees earned their salvation. Well, the fact is the phrase works of the law was actually finally found in a Qumran scroll, 4QMMT. And in that particular brief scroll, the writer is saying, we have a particular interpretation of a text. In Judaism, it's called halakha. And so if you're following Hillel's halakha, that's his way of doing things. You can follow Shammai's halakha, that's Shammai's way of doing things. But halakha is the legal interpretation given to a text that tells you how to live out this text. In works of the law, as it's found that phrase in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it refers to their interpretation. That is their hermeneutic. So Paul in Galatians isn't saying the Pharisees or the Judaizers, I should say, the Judaizers aren't trying to teach salvation by works. That's just Western thinking. Paul's arguing against a hermeneutic that is being demanded to be believed in, much like fundamentalists require you to believe in the inerrant Bible before they'll even go a step further with you. And Paul says we aren't justified by our hermeneutic. We're justified by trust. So again, this literature provides ways of seeing the writing of the writers and their writings in the New Testament period within the context of this larger framework that utilizes similar language and terminology, and we can also see where these writers, and eventually you'll see that Jesus is moving within these things, challenging certain things, embracing others. There are 2 books out of a whole series of books, because every other year, the Enoch Seminar, headed up by Gabriele Boccaccini, I think he's up at Michigan State University. Every 2 years they run the Enoch Seminar, and so they'll publish, Eerdmans publishes the papers from that. I just have 2 here, for example. So here's Enoch and the Mosaic Torah, and it's looking at the Book of Jubilees. And you can even see I got it at half price. It retailed for $55. I picked it up for $33. Yay. I'm a cheapskate when it comes to buying books. So Enoch and the Mosaic Torah, or here, one of the more recent volumes, Enoch and the Synoptic Gospels. And again, books like this they get you into this other literature, in this case, a pseudepigraphal document, the Book of Enoch, and they are showing how the New Testament writers or other Jews are engaging these various traditions. And again, what's going to stand out with Jesus is not what you think. In other words, when it comes, for example, to holiness, Jesus was a holy man, and he was perceived as such. And so those today that want to turn Jesus into some kind of hipster drunkard that likes to hang out at bars and drink beers with people because I'm just trying to identify in solidarity with them, they have no idea that's not Jesus. Jesus today, even from my perspective, he's a holy man. I mean, he was an ascetic. There's so much about him that I'm not, and you're not. And to try and take him out of that context and turn him into something else, again, is false. And so this is why we want to work within this literature of Second Temple Judaism. Now, there's a lot of books written on the Dead Sea Scrolls, folks, an awful lot of books written on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have, just in my little teeny library here, I have over 40 books on the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting they come from this group or that group or this time period, or they did this. I mean, there's just, debates and disputes, and there's certain now growing consensus about issues. But whenever you, again, any of these disciplines, you're in the middle of debates and interpretive debates on things. But James Vanderkam has an award-winning book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Today, very short book. And if you wanted a great introduction, again, each of these books I'm recommending is something you can trust the scholarship in. I'm not saying that they're perfect or inerrant or infallible, but you can trust the scholarship, okay? So Vanderkam's Dead Sea Scrolls Today is the best introduction. If I was going to teach a class, these are the books I would use and have my students read. And Vanderkam is an excellent introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe you want to learn about the Samaritans. The Samaritan study has blossomed in the last 20 years. It's astonishing how many excellent books and resource articles have been published on Samaritan thinking, Samaritan theology, history, and everything else. But the most recent excellent book is by Reinhard Pumer, The Samaritans. And do you know there are still about 300 living Samaritans today that live there in Israel near Mount Gerizim, where they practice their ancient faith? Do you know that? The Pharisees are the Samaritans are the only group from Jesus' day that still exist. So you can pick up Pumer's book. It's a wonderful book. Now, there are a couple of books on the Pharisees that are very, very good. I put one in the bibliography by Jacob Neusner, and that's a very technical book. But there's a very, very readable book on Jesus and the Pharisees by John Boker. And John, this little book contains a lot of primary source material in it. That's one of its values. But one of the reasons Jesus got into so much trouble with the Pharisees is because he was most like them. So much so that Harvey Falk could write a book called Jesus the Pharisee. Jesus was very much like a Hillelite Pharisee. And that's why he got in so much trouble with them. Who do you get in trouble with? You guys get mostly in trouble with the evangelicals and the fundamentalists because you're so close to them. You were once one of them, and now you're slightly different from them, and that's why we get in so much trouble with them. Or in my case, the liberals. I was so much like them at one point, but now I'm not. So it's the same thing with Jesus. Jesus is really like a Pharisee. So it's not Jesus versus the Pharisees in the gospel tradition. It's a Pharisaic way of living versus other Pharisaic ways of living. So put that in your pipe and smoke it for a wee bit. The Targums, as you know, are Aramaic paraphrases that are recited in the synagogue. They were written down. We possess these later written texts that have obviously been edited in the tradition before we get them several hundred years after Jesus. So when you're reading the Targums, you're not reading what Jesus heard. You're reading something very close to what Jesus may have heard, but you're not reading what he heard. But they're absolutely remarkable. And you can see, for example, if you read the Targum to Isaiah, the Aramaic paraphrase to Isaiah, Jesus really took a lot of that to heart and took his whole understanding of the reign of God right from there. In fact, it's a phrase that occurs over and over and over again in that particular Targum, of Second Isaiah in particular. And Jesus seems to have adopted that. And it would not have been something he would have heard from a reading of the Hebrew text. So the Targums are very important because, again, Jesus would have heard them. And so Targum and Testament by Martin McNamara is your introduction. It's your introduction to the Targums. And then you can go read the individual Targums. And there are 3 Targums, for example, on Torah. There's the Targum Onkelos, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, and now what am I missing? Onkelos, Pseudo-Jonathan, and there's a third one. And they're each a little different. So you can go check that out. Now, there's really, to my knowledge, there's no book yet ever been published on the Sadducees. And as far as I know, I don't have any books on the scribes of Second Temple Judaism. But there is a wonderful book called Pharisees, Scribes, and Sadducees by Anthony Salverini. And this book is, again, scholarly, but not over your head, okay? And if you wanted to get a good grasp of the scribes and the Sadducees as well as the Pharisees, well, Salverini is the place to go. Now, this is the last book I'm going to recommend. It's the one book I would encourage you to consider purchasing and putting in your library. The rabbinic tradition, what we call the rabbinic tradition, from the perspective of the rabbi, the later rabbi, starts, of course, back under Ezra. I don't think there are too many scholars that are going to take it that far back. The scribal tradition, perhaps, but not the so-called rabbinic tradition. And in Jesus' day, rabbi was a title of honor, not a title that is given because one has achieved a certain status of education. That's what happens later. But rabbi is a title of honor and respect, that one is a learned teacher. And the Jewish scholar Ephraim Urbach has gone and collected from all these various rabbinic sources by topic the sayings and teachings of the rabbis. It is a big book. It is called The Sages by Ephraim Urbach. Again, this is in the bibliography list. But in this book, for example, just to give you an idea of some of the categories, there's a chapter on the belief in one God and all that the rabbis have to say about this. And it deals with the monotheistic concept, the recitation of the Shema and the Decalogue, the negation of idolatry, the denial of providence, and the rabbi's response to Epicureanism, faith and its meaning. Okay. There's a chapter on the Shekinah, the presence of God in the world. There's one on the power and might of God. There's one on magic and miracle, the power of the divine name, the celestial retinue, that is how the rabbis perceived this whole heavenly host thing and how they named them and ranked them and organized them. And listen, the rabbis were doing this long before the charismatics. Okay. There's a chapter on the human, one on providence. There's a whole chapter on the written and the oral law. There's a chapter called Acceptance of the Yoke of the Kingdom of Heaven, Love and Reverence. Does that remind you of any saying of Jesus? It should. That is, when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, any Jew would automatically have as part of the tapes in their head references to the yoke of the Torah. So there's things happening here. At any rate, Ephraim Urbach's book, this, I don't know how much it cost. I picked mine up for $8.50, guys. I don't know what to tell you. But this book is a treasure trove of Jewish wisdom, real wisdom from the time of Jesus and a little past, right in that period. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. This is almost a devotional book for me from time to time. It also gives me headaches because I find myself really arguing with the rabbis, but then I think that's what rabbis do when they get together, I forget, there's a saying, put 3 rabbis in a room and you'll come out with 10 opinions, something like that, So at any rate, why do you want to learn all this? Why would you do this? Well, how could you possibly understand John chapter 4, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, if you didn't understand the history of Samaritans and Judaism and their various ways and modes of thinking, what they had in common, what they didn't, or the influence of the Samaritan mission on the early church, or the Gospel of John or Luke? I mean, how can you begin to read Matthew without understanding the Pharisees? Or Mark without understanding the Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees, and the conflicts Jesus has with them? Who were these people? What were they about? Why did they really reject him? What was going on? What was it that about Jesus' teaching that is distinctive, which doesn't make it un-Jewish? It can be very Jewish at its core. And we're going to talk about the distinctive of nonviolence next week from the perspective of a Jewish Jesus scholar, David Flusser. So all of this literature, what it does is it creates a background. It gives you information to have a background so that when you go read the Gospels, knowing that they are developments of this Jesus story, the narratives are compressed, you will be able to fill in the gaps with good, solid, historical, cultural, political, economic, theological, liturgical skin and bones, muscle, and you know what I'm saying. You'll fill it in properly. Unlike the average Christian who reads a text like this, goes to an old reference work, and then fills in the story with all kinds of false things, and then begins to play that out. After we're finished with the lecture and we're in private conversation, Derek reminded me to share the story I want to share about what happens when you have a text and you fill it with false assumptions. Okay. So what learning about Jesus culture does is it's not a direct study of Jesus, but it gives you the ability to, as it were, enter into his world, the things that he had to deal with, the kinds of ideas that were floating around, the way Jewish life was practiced and why it was practiced that way, and why certain groups insisted on certain things and others insisted on others, why and how Jesus came into conflict, why and how Jesus as a healer in his lifetime is important in the gospel tradition, but you'll discover he's not the only healer. There are others in his lifetime who are remembered for their healing or their miracles, like Onias or Honi the circle drawer, who are contemporaries of Jesus. Jesus is not the only miracle worker, so to speak, but he has a very charismatic approach, not modern charismatic, but charismatic in the sense of called and equipped for this mission that he's given. And when you have a good idea of the background of this, of Jesus' culture, then he becomes clearer. There's another piece in here that's really interesting to me, and I didn't bring any books from my library on it, and that's and because this stuff is still very scholarly, and they haven't learned how to write about it yet, so regular people can understand it. But it's the amount of folklore and superstition within Jesus Judaism. There was a lot of superstition and belief in magic and all kinds of things in Jesus' day. There were a lot of what I guess you could call fetishes with regard to amulets, that were worn, or incantations that were used, and all of this kind of thing that is very, very certain groups would certainly find the use of this stuff amongst the population to be more pagan. But the regular Jew out there, the regular person, is still very much influenced by that, just like the regular person that can go to church on Sundays reads their horoscope every day, right? So there is that to take into consideration as well, what's called folk religion, because the regular people did not practice Judaism the way the Pharisees did, or the Sadducees did, or the Essenes did. They just didn't. And we shouldn't assume they did. The regular people were the regular people. And I mean, part of what made them what the rabbis called Am Haaretz, people of the earth, people of the land. When the rabbis used that phrase of the regular common person, it was because their manners, their etiquette, their religious sensibilities were all folkloric and superstitious. And so Jesus comes along to these people of the land, and he starts doing these rather miraculous things. And that's one of the reasons why he is so attractive to them. That's part of their worldview, magic and miracles. And Jesus is a miracle worker. So having a context for Jesus' life is important. Some years back, in the 60s, it was in the 1960s, it was, I believe, the Bonhoeffer scholars that really showed the importance of understanding a theologian's work within the historical context in which they lived. And I think ever since then, it's become imperative upon any biographer of any thinker in the 20th century, but I'm just talking theologians, to understand the contexts in which that theologian was writing. And unfortunately, I mean, I've studied a lot of systematic theologies, but I don't know these folks' contexts. And I suspect if I did, I would understand them better. But the contexts of the writers that I know, like Barth and Bonhoeffer, or those that I've known personally and know their context, like Rene Girard, the context is everything. A text without a context is a pretext. Or, as Jared McKenna says, a text without a context is a con. You have to have context in order to make sense of anything. This is something I tell my Greek students. Sam has heard this in class. Words don't have meanings. Words are given meanings by their context. Okay? Linda's also heard this. So you can't go to the Bible and say this word means X because you did some kind of fake word study. No, words have meaning within context, just as your language does too. So everything has a context, and that includes the life of Jesus, who he was, what he experienced, what he underwent. And next week, we will begin to just touch on the possibility of being able to recover certain elements of Jesus' own self-understanding. That is how he understood himself. And in that process, we're only going to be able to do that because we have this bigger Second Temple context and understand the various self-understandings of others and how they understood themselves. And with that, this picture of Jesus becomes more clarified the more we learn about his background, the more we learn about his environment and culture, the more we saturate ourselves in that, then he becomes clearer. So while there's no direct access to Jesus, there's not even intellectual or historical direct access, and this is one of the follies of the so-called quests for the historical Jesus. They're looking for intellectual solidity there. There's no direct connection. Mystically, intellectually, philosophically, there's just no direct connection. Jesus comes to each of us, and when he does, it's so startling that we have to ask, who are you? We do. That's essential to the process of what the church calls conversion. All right, so I will look forward to seeing you next week.